My whole life, I heard one word from my mother: failure. Even after I achieved everything I'd ever dreamed of. I was 6 years old the first time I sewed a dress for my doll out of a scrap from my mother's old blouse. I remember carrying that doll proudly into the kitchen where she was drinking her coffee before her morning training session, and how she glanced at my work for barely a second before saying, "You ruined my blouse. Go do something useful instead." I was 6, and she'd already made it clear exactly what my passion was worth. My mother, Barbara, had been a competitive gymnast in her youth, winning medals at state championships, and the local paper had even written about her once. Later she built her own business, a chain of hardware supply stores that grew from one small shop to 14 locations across the state. She was a woman used to winning, used to measuring success in medals and revenue, in concrete achievements you could show people and hear them gasp over. And I was nothing like that. I was mediocre at math, hated gym class, and the happiest moments of my childhood were the ones spent in the corner of my room with a needle and thread, sewing clothes for my dolls, cutting patterns out of old newspapers, sketching dress designs in a notebook instead of doing homework. My mother saw all of it as a waste of time, something frivolous, nothing like the qualities she valued: leadership, drive, concrete wins. When I was 12, I signed up for the school's sewing club without asking her, using birthday money from my grandmother to buy my first real fabric. When she found out, she didn't yell, she just said coldly, "You're wasting time on nonsense instead of bringing your grades up. With that kind of attitude, you're never going to amount to anything, Natalie." That became the refrain of my childhood: "You're never going to amount to anything." My father left when I was 10, and after that my mother got even harder, even less patient with anything that didn't fit her idea of success. She raised me alone while building her business, and she was probably genuinely exhausted from the constant weight of responsibility. But a child doesn't understand an adult's exhaustion. A child just hears the words and absorbs them as the truth about who she is. By high school I'd started sewing real clothes, not just for dolls, first for myself, then for classmates who noticed my pieces and asked me to make something similar. That was the first money I ever earned on my own, the first time I felt genuinely good at something, despite everything my mother had said. But when I proudly showed her my first paycheck from an order, she just raised a skeptical eyebrow and said, "That's not a career, Natalie. That's a hobby that's never going to feed you." I enrolled in fashion design school against my mother's wishes, using money my grandmother had left me. My mother took it as a personal insult, a rejection of everything she'd tried to give me: stability, practicality, a sensible approach to life. She told me then, "Do what you want, but don't expect me to fund your fantasies." We barely spoke for almost 6 months after that conversation. The years of school, then a few years working as an assistant in a small tailoring shop, then my own studio, which barely broke even for the first 3 years, I went through almost all of it without any support from her. Our relationship gradually shrank into something formal and distant: a birthday phone call, a short New Year's greeting, occasionally running into each other at a family gathering where we exchanged small talk while avoiding anything real. I knew my mother kept tabs on my progress through mutual acquaintances, through my Aunt Carol, who sometimes passed along little comments. "Your mom asked how the business is going," Carol would say, and every time I felt a bitter taste at the word business, like even secondhand, my mother couldn't bring herself to call what I did a real profession instead of playing at being a grown-up. Years passed, and I slowly built a name for myself in the industry, doing small local shows, landing my first features in fashion magazines, and every time something significant happened in my career, I'd imagine telling my mother about it, imagine seeing even a flicker of pride in her eyes instead of the usual skepticism. But I never actually worked up the nerve to call her with that kind of news, afraid I'd hear that same cold reaction I'd heard my whole life. Last year I got a call from the organizing committee of a major fashion week, offering me my own solo runway show, the first of my career, the biggest opportunity I'd ever had. I cried from happiness when I hung up the phone, and the following 3 months were the most intense of my entire life. I barely slept, sewing, resuing, adjusting every detail of the collection I named Roots, in honor of the whole path I'd walked to get to that point. 2 weeks before the show, I worked up the courage to call my mother. My heart was pounding as I dialed her number, and when she answered with her usual reserved "hello," I told her briefly about the event, trying to sound calm even though I was shaking inside. I have a solo show at Fashion Week. It means a lot to me. I'd really like you to come, I said, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I'll check my schedule, she finally answered in that same tone she always used for any request of mine, and I hung up already knowing, with a heavy feeling, what the answer would be. The days before the show flew by in a frantic blur of preparation, fittings, rehearsals with the models, endless coordination with the organizers. I mailed my mother a formal invitation with the address, time, all the details, and even called again 3 days before the event to remind her of the start time. She just said, "I remember, Natalie," and there wasn't a trace of anticipation or excitement in her voice. Show day arrived, and I stood backstage, shaking, not so much from nerves about the collection as from wondering whether my mother would show up. I'd arranged for a seat to be held for her in the front row, next to my Aunt Carol, who'd come to support me. As the venue started filling up, I kept peeking out from backstage every minute, scanning the crowd for a familiar face, but the seat next to my aunt stayed empty. The show started right on schedule, and despite the ache in my chest, I gathered every ounce of will I had and walked out to present the collection, smiling, focusing on work I'd done better than anything else in my life. The audience applauded, critics nodded approvingly, reporters photographed every model's walk, and from the outside it looked like a triumph. But when I came out for the final bow and looked out at the crowd, the seat next to my aunt was still empty, and in that second, the whole triumph felt hollow to me too. After the show came interviews, congratulations from colleagues, calls from journalists, and I smiled mechanically, said thank you, answered questions, while inside I felt only an exhausting emptiness. When all the formalities were finally over and I could go home, it was late in the evening. I walked into my apartment, kicked off the heels I'd worn all day, and sat down on the floor of my entryway, finally letting myself cry after months of pressure and one evening of disappointment. That's when the doorbell rang. I wiped my face with my sleeve and went to answer it, thinking it was probably a neighbor or a food delivery I'd forgotten I ordered. But standing on the doorstep was a courier holding an enormous bouquet of white and cream roses, the biggest bouquet I'd ever seen in my life. "Delivery for you," the courier said, holding out the flowers along with a small envelope. I took the bouquet with shaking hands, carried it inside, set it on the table, and opened the envelope, my heart pounding so hard I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Inside was my mother's handwriting, the same neat, even handwriting she'd used to sign my school report cards. "Natalie, I came." I stood outside the entrance for almost an hour, watching through the glass doors as you walked the runway, as the audience applauded you. But I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I don't know why I was so afraid. Maybe because I was scared you wouldn't want me there after everything I've said to you all these years. Your collection is beautiful. You are beautiful. I am prouder of you than I could ever put into words. Mom. I stood in the middle of my apartment holding that note, and tears ran down my face, no longer from disappointment but from something else entirely, a mix of relief, grief for the years we'd lost, and unexpected hope. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. She answered almost immediately, like she'd been waiting by the phone. "Natalie," she said in a quiet voice, nothing like her usual reserved tone. "Mom, I got the flowers," I said, my voice shaking. "Why didn't you come in? I wanted you there, next to me." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line, and then my mother spoke, and for the first time in my entire life, I heard genuine vulnerability in her voice. "I didn't know how to walk in there and sit among people who probably think I've been a terrible mother. I spent years telling you your work wasn't serious, that it was just a game, and suddenly I saw a room full of people who'd come specifically to see your work, who were in awe of what you create. I felt ashamed, Natalie. Ashamed of every word I ever said to you." I sat down on the floor, pressing the phone to my ear, unable to hold back my tears. "Why didn't you ever tell me that before? Why did you keep calling me a failure?" "Because I didn't understand," she answered, her voice trembling. "I measured success in medals and revenue, because that's the only thing I knew. I was afraid you'd suffer, choosing a path that seemed unstable to me, and instead of support, I chose criticism, thinking it would protect you from disappointment. I was wrong, sweetheart. I was so wrong, and it took standing outside those glass doors watching your success for me to finally understand that. We talked that evening for almost 2 hours, longer than we talked in the last several years combined. She told me how she'd followed every one of my magazine features, how she'd kept clippings of my work in a drawer of her desk, never once working up the courage to tell me about it directly. I told her how long I'd waited for even one word of recognition, how every cold reaction of hers had hurt me even into adulthood. "I want to see your collection," she said toward the end of the call. "Really see it, not through glass doors. Can I come to you tomorrow?" "Yes," I answered, smiling through my tears. "Come, Mom. I'll show you everything." The next day she came to my studio, and I showed her every dress in the collection, told her the story behind every detail, every fabric choice, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine interest in her eyes instead of patient tolerance. She picked up one of the dresses, ran her fingers carefully over the embroidery, and said quietly, "This is truly beautiful, Natalie. I regret every year I didn't get to see this."